Hi everyone, welcome back to the final part of our lecture on Chapter 2, Culture and Communication. This is Part 3. In this section, we are going to play with some terms and get ourselves a little bit more familiar with different words like race, ethnicity, and gender. And then we're going to talk about how our language impacts the way we perceive the world. And lastly, we're going to wrap it all up with tying together all of the lessons we've learned in this chapter about implicit bias, what culture is, cultural values, what race and gender do for us as human beings and how they impact our communication, and real steps that we can start taking in order to develop our intercultural communication competence. Let's dive into it. We're going to go straight into understanding these really complicated terms that tend to be mixed up in society often, and the definitions that I'm going to give you are the social scientific, academic definitions of what these terms actually mean. A lot of these terms, as I've mentioned, like race, ethnicity, or gender and sex, have been used either interchangeably or incorrectly in a lot of different contexts in everyday language, and so please be mindful of that. As we're going through this, you may have to unlearn or kind of get rid of pre-existing ideas of what these terms mean in order to fully understand what their intent is and how they're meant to be used when we're talking about identity. So the first one that I'm going to review is race and ethnicity. This is the one that is the most complex and the one that I actually get the most questions about, because it is hard to strip the differences between the two because they intersect in a lot of different ways. But let's go ahead and dive into it. Woo, there's a lot going on here, but let me break it down for you. So a lot of my students ask me, when do I use race? When do I use ethnicity? I know that this can get really complicated, and I'm sure that all of the different forms that you have to fill out either for work or for the census don't necessarily help, because sometimes when they're asking you what your race is, they may be actually asking ethnicity, or vice versa. If they're asking you what your ethnicity is, they might actually mean race. And so even on government documents, these terms are not necessarily used in the right way, and it can cause a lot of confusion. So to kind of break them down here, let's start with race, because I think that's the one that tends to be the most used in a variety of different contexts. Race is a category created by human beings, and these categories help to explain physical differences or physical differences in appearance between people based off of where their ancestors originated from. Usually, race has not a lot of help for us as communicators to explain individual differences because it primarily is focused off the physical traits. However, race has a more direct impact on how others view us, and specifically what implicit biases are triggered for or against us when people see us. Because of course, one of the first things that people see when they see us are the way that we look, and they classify the way that we look into a racial category. And again, what is connected to that racial category, or what a person viewing us thinks of that racial category, is triggered when they see us. Ethnicity is usually more commonly used in everyday conversation, I feel, at least the terms that people are using. Ethnicity refers to the degree to which a person identifies with a group, and this is usually based off your nationality or kind of your loyalty to a certain culture or unifying perspective. Let me give you an example. So if you were to just look at me and not actually ask me what my ethnicity is, but if most people look at me and classify my race as Asian. So I'm racially Asian, and that is a category. Asian is a racial category used to explain people that look similar to me, and categorize them based off coming from the continent of Asia. Interestingly enough, the continent of Asia includes India, so my Indians in the house, y'all are Asian by race, but of course, racially, when people think of the word Asian, they think of people that look like me and not necessarily Indians from India. Okay, I'm not talking about Native Americans, I'm talking about Indians from India, the country of India. So, my ethnicity, though, is different from my race, because if you were to ask me to really self-identify myself, I wouldn't just call myself Asian. I would say, actually, I'm Vietnamese American. And that's an ethnicity. That is a term, Vietnamese American, that refers to the idea that I have an association or a loyalty to Vietnam, my heritage, and I'm also an American, which identifies my kind of unifying perspective or my loyalty to America and being an American citizen. So Vietnamese American is more representative of who I am as a person, because when you hear Vietnamese American, you know that I am a Vietnamese person living in America, and that's a very different experience, right, than just being an American or just being a Vietnamese person. Another example of an ethnicity might be the use of the word Chicano or Chicana. Chicano or Chicana are words used to refer to individuals whose heritage or ancestors stem from Mexico but now live in the United States. The reason for why these terms are so important, such as Vietnamese American or being Chicano, refer to the idea that there's a very intersectional or very unique experience with being a person from that heritage but living in the United States. Because, for example, I'm a Vietnamese American woman. My life and my experiences are very different than that of a Vietnamese woman living in Vietnam right now. So while she and I might share a race of being Asian, and we might share being Vietnamese, our ethnicities will differ because my experience of being a Vietnamese American and my worldview is very different than than a woman that might have just lived in Vietnam all her life and never left. That's why the word Chicano is very helpful, because it really speaks to the unique experience of Mexican individuals who live here in the United States, who are descendants of or are themselves immigrants from Mexico. Because, of course, individuals that have Mexican heritage but live here in the United States have a very different worldview and experience than individuals that have always lived in Mexico and have never left Mexico. So that's an example of the difference between race and ethnicity. You can see that the terms for ethnicity, such as Chicano or the term Vietnamese American, helps you understand more about that person interpersonally one-on-one. However, race is an incredibly important word to be mindful of, because race, like I said previously, dictates a lot of the access points that we get in society, right? It dictates the resources and the ability for us to thrive in a variety of different contexts, because how we are classified racially triggers different implicit bias for people around us, and that might work for us positively or negatively. So for example, during COVID, there was a lot of thought that Chinese people or Asian people in general were carrying the virus, or were the cause or the root of the virus coming to the United States. So while beforehand I had never really experienced a lot of overt discrimination publicly, because of COVID, I experienced that in grocery stores when people would not want to stand next to me, or would say generally negative things about Asians in front of me because they thought that I was carrying the virus, or that in any way I was related to, bringing the virus here to the United States. Of course I'm not, but because of my race, the way I'm presenting Asian, they associate that with COVID, right? And so you can see there that it didn't matter that I'm Vietnamese American, right? I can't say, no, I'm Vietnamese American, because those people's implicit biases against Asian people was already triggered when they saw me. We also see this in the experience of Black individuals in America, right? Black individuals, or the term Black people, is a racial category, and that category is so crucial right now for us to understand, because Black individuals in America experience a very different America than the rest of us. How they experience going through the social justice system, the criminal justice system, how they experience their interactions with police officers, how they experience access to education, access to loans, finances, all those types of things historically have been limited to them. If you actually want more information on that, you can read Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi. He does a great job of kind of reviewing a lot of the historical racist policies, such as redlining, that made it incredibly difficult for individuals that were Black to be able to access the resources they need for upward mobility. So that's an example of how, again, race, a racial category, is so important for us to be mindful of, because how you're treated in society ultimately, as I've said before, your group membership impacts your self-concept. So all of the experiences we get with either our ethnicity or our race ultimately become a part of our self-concept, because they, our world experiences make us who we are, right? Now, I know that this can get even more complicated, because technically Two people can be the same ethnicity but entirely different races, and you're like, how is that possible? That doesn't make any sense. So it gets really complicated. A lot of times academic language and kind of what officially the term is, doesn't necessarily match up with how we normally talk about it, right? For example, the United States government created the term Hispanic. This term is a category that basically refers to people that come from Spanish-speaking countries. Of course, that's not necessarily always helpful because there's a lot of Spanish-speaking countries, if y'all haven't noticed. So just saying that you're someone from a Spanish-speaking country doesn't necessarily always describe things as well, as clearly or explicitly. However, there's also the term Latino, and the word Latino refers to people that are from Latin descent, right? Which is a little bit more specific, but also can be confusing because just because you are from a country from Latin America, that doesn't necessarily mean you share a lot of the same traits, right? For example, Mexico is in Latin America. Mexican people may self-identify as Latino. However, other countries that speak Portuguese or don't speak Spanish may not identify with that same identity. So it gets really complicated in that respect, right? So if you've ever filled out a survey and wondered why on that survey or on that census there's a category called non-Hispanic white, there's a reason for that, because a lot of Latino or Hispanic people, because either you pick being from Latin origin or Spanish-speaking origin, it can get confusing. So oftentimes they don't provide those explicit categories on paperwork, and so those people are forced to identify as Caucasian or white. And so the term non-Hispanic white was put out there as a racial category because Hispanic and Latino are technically ethnic categories because they refer to your unifying perspective. So the government, to track race, had to create a category called non-Hispanic white in order to categorize that. So it can get a little confusing. So for Latinx people, they might not know, which kind of thing to bubble in because of that reason. For those of you wondering why that X is there, that's a degendered term for the word Latino or Latina. Of course, it doesn't put down the word Latino or Latina. I have a lot of Latina colleagues that are very proud to self-refer to them as Latina, but the word Latinx is a way to refer to all Latin people of all different gender expressions in one word, so it's a lot easier. So I know that was a quick crash course on race and ethnicity, and I don't want to kind of belabor this a little bit anymore, but if you want more information, I have this really cool video right here that you can view on race and ethnicity, and it kind of breaks down a lot of the differences between the two, and again, the complexities that can come along with them, and it also gives you other different examples. So now that we've kind of entered into these complex terms, let's move on to gender and sex. Gender and sex is also something that is used interchangeably, especially on paperwork, and that can be incredibly problematic because gender is not the same as biological sex. So the word sex refers to whether or not you are biologically born male or female with genitalia. So think of kind of whether or not you have a vagina or a penis, or if you're intersex, that is your sex. Fun fact, about 1 out of every 1,000 babies, I believe, is actually born intersex. So meaning that they are born with both the physical, biological traits of both males and females. So that's your sex, right? So your sex is whether or not you have male or female genitalia. However, your gender is also, just like race and just like culture, it's a social construct, meaning that gender is something that human beings created. It's a continuum of masculinity and femininity, right? And so it's important to recognize that human beings decided what is girly, right? Or what is manly, right? We decided at some point that pink was associated with females and that colors like blue are associated with males. Those are not decisions that have anything to do with our biology. Those are decisions that we made as human beings to decide this is what gender is, right? Gender is often talked about as a binary, so you're either a man or a woman, and that's an inaccurate way to represent gender, because if it's a social construct, if it's something that human beings created, it's a fluid one at that. Just like when we refer to our cultural values, Those values exist on a continuum, right? And so does gender, because gender is a socially constructed, human constructed idea. So for example, if you look at me, I am what you would call a cisgender woman, meaning that I am a woman that presents as what society thinks is acceptable for a woman to look like. So I wear makeup, I have long hair, right? If you see me bopping around on campus, I'm usually wearing heels and skirts. And so I perform my gender, or I act out my gender in a way that society thinks is appropriate. So because of that reason, I don't really get that much flack for my gender, because what people think my sex is and my gender is, they match, right? However, oftentimes as human beings, we try to force gender presentations or gender performances on people who are not necessarily comfortable with performing that gender identity. So a small example might be one of my colleagues. She grew up as a woman, and she is someone that really likes to kind of dress in basketball shorts, and she likes to be more comfortable in male clothing, and so a lot of individuals would refer to her as a tomboy. Even the idea of being a tomboy is a gendered idea, because the expectation is you're female, you should be dressed or looking this way. And the fact that you don't makes you a tomboy. Does that make sense? So in a lot of ways, as you can see with these examples, we associate someone's gender with what their sex is. So basically, we say, if you have a vagina, you should be performing womanhood this way. And if you have a penis, you should be performing manhood this way. And that's not necessarily so, right? Our genitalia and our sexual orientation doesn't always connect to or determine what our gender is. One example might be, a lot of my male Latino students share with me the idea of machismo. So the idea of machismo is this idea that a man has to kind of be this manly man, right? To provide for his family, to perform certain gendered behaviors, right? A student of mine once told me that his father became very irate and very upset with him when he started wearing skinny jeans, because his father associated skinny jeans with femininity and womanhood, and so he very much thought his son was not performing machismo. He wasn't looking machismo, right? And so we can see there that that's just a small example of how gender constructs, or how we think of gender as a society, impacts the way that people perceive others, and how maybe we're influenced to dress or look, right, or act around certain people. But remember that, like I said, gender is a fluid spectrum. If you actually look at even just photos of our founding fathers here in the U.S., right? So if you kind of look at photos like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, those folks at that time, they wore wigs, they had makeup, and they had little bows on their heels. Yes, they wore high heels. So men used to wear high heels and tights and makeup, and that was considered masculine behavior. And of course, now we don't associate those things with masculine behavior, right? We associate high heels with womanhood. And so that's an example of how historically over time, gender presentations have changed and will continue to change and will continue to shift, because again, it's a continuum, it's a construct that human beings created, so it's ever evolving and ever changing. So I want y'all to kind of break away from society's push to try to associate your genitalia, your sex, with your gender, right? Because, like I just said, men, historically, back in the day, were men, had male genitalia, and yet wore makeup, had heels, and performed their gender in ways that we would now associate with womanhood. So that's an example that gender is not dependent on your sex and should not be dependent on your sex, right? That's where people like me who are cisgender have a lot of privilege, because no one ever challenges my womanhood, but someone might challenge my transgender colleague's womanhood, or someone might challenge the womanhood of my colleague who is called a tomboy, right? And so for those of you whose gender matches their sex, like me, yay, right? But for those of you, and when I say matches, I mean what society thinks should match, not what actually does match. Let me clarify that. So society says, yeah, you're female, with female genitalia, sure, have long hair and wear makeup. And so I happen to be comfortable expressing my gender this way. But we have to remember that gender is an expression, right? And it's a performance. And so just because society tells us that men and women should behave and dress in a certain way, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has anything to do with your biological sex. Okay? So resist that urge to try to force people to look or act a certain way because of their genitalia, is the lesson. Because it doesn't make sense to do so. Moving on, let's talk about age. Age is a fantastic spectrum as well to really look at, because even though age is something that is observable, right? So you can look at someone's age and count, right, how many years they've been living. Age is also impacted by perception. You can even hear it in phrases like act your age, right? We expect certain things out of certain people when they're certain ages. And also different cultures view ages differently. Western cultures, like here in America, we tend to honor youth, right? We love youthful looking people, and we have positive associations with youth and negative associations with being of senior age. That's why we have a whole beauty industry that is focused on getting rid of your wrinkles, and we have a whole kind of beauty industry that's built off of trying to keep you looking youthful, because that's something that we value here in America. However, there are other cultures that actually value older ages more. So, for example, most collectivist cultures actually view individuals in their community that are older as wiser, as more valuable, and as people that should be respected and listened to. Fun little research fact here. Maybe not fun, but I love research, so it's fun for me. People who believe older adults have trouble communicating are less likely to interact with them and more likely to use patronizing speech when they do interact. What that means is that individuals who already walk in with the preconception or the implicit bias that older adults are, somehow slower or not as intelligent or not as capable of something, tend to struggle more in those interactions because those implicit biases are clouding the way that they are decoding their interaction with that older individual. And so we know that then, because of a multitude of the ways that we view and perceive age, communication challenges come out of different generations trying to work together. So it's very important to be cognizant of what perspectives and what worldview you have at the age that you're at, because your age at times does dictate your perspective and your worldview, and that's important to remember because it will affect your communication, both the way you encode messages and the way you decode messages. Next up is persons with disabilities. You'll note that I always try to use people first language, so I don't say disabled people. I say persons with disabilities because that's part of their identity, however, it does not define them. One of the challenging things about being a person with a disability is that they're often pressured to conforming to spaces that are not made for them, right? And so this world, to put it bluntly, is made for individuals who do not have disabilities, right? Who are what you may refer to as able-bodied, right? And even then, I'm not a huge fan of that phrasing. And so that's a big challenge. And so often persons with disabilities are required to kind of either choose between two different ways of managing those challenges. One, they can assimilate, which is when they conform to the dominant group, right? Your textbook refers it as non-disabled, so I'm going to use that here. Or they can accommodate, which is when you acknowledge your disability and you request for ways that can be accommodated. One beautiful example of this is our DPS office here at Chaffey College. So our DPS office is an office that serves students with disabilities, and students with disabilities can go to that office and request different accommodations to support them throughout their educational journey. And so I, as an instructor, will then provide those accommodations in order to support my students with disabilities, so they are on a level playing field with everyone else as far as the ability to access me, access content, and learn. And so accommodation is really what we strive through, but we know that persons with disabilities living in the United States more often than not are forced to assimilate or just conform to the desires of those of the dominant group. So as competent communicators, remember, you have to treat a disability as one feature or one aspect of a person and not their defining characteristic. This tends to be a perceptual error for those who do not have disabilities. It is common that those who do not have disabilities to perceive others who do have disabilities as their disability defining them, right? For those of you who know individuals with disabilities, you probably have a stronger grasp of the skill and you understand how to always see the human being first and not the disability first. Next up, socioeconomic status, also known as SES. Social class has a huge impact on the way that we communicate because money and access to different resources impacts your experience in life. It really does. The neighborhood that you grow up in, the educational opportunities provided to you or not provided to you impact your worldview, and anything that is part of your worldview impacts the way you communicate. Interestingly enough, most people in the United States either identify as middle class for the most part, which is interesting because we've also found that socioeconomic status might be a state of mind. The reason being is because a lot of people tend to associate with being middle class, right? So when asked on a survey, people will typically self-refer to themselves as middle class. And when you look at that data, the people that refer to themselves as middle class tend to range from $30,000 to $100,000 a year in income. That's a huge disparity, right? So we can see there that the class you feel you belong to is also in part, not whole, in part a product of the perception of how you perceive the class level that you're at, right? But remember, it's called socioeconomic for a reason, because we can't strip away economics or finances or access to money away from the social aspect of it or the social resources that you get as a result of having access to money. So the socio in social class or socioeconomic status also refers to whether or not you have what we call social capital to navigate different aspects of society. One example is first-generation college students. Shout out to my first-gen students out there listening to this video. You know where to find me if you need more support. I'm here because I totally get the challenge that comes along with being a first-gen student. First-gen students are individuals who are the first in their family to attend college, and this can be incredibly challenging because navigating college with terms like units, right, and financial aid, and all these kind of other really complicated terms that comes with being in college, usually individuals that have had parents go to college or other people in their family go to college have that cultural support, have that social support, right? They have a support network of people that can help them get through college and navigate it. If you are a first-generation college student, you don't have that social network and that social support, right? Not to say that your family isn't supportive, but if you don't have someone in your family that has had that experience, you're more on your own when it comes to having to navigate the complicated system of college. So first-generation college students then have to usually feel like they're in between two different worlds because being in college really is a huge part of your life when you're in it, right? It's basically like another full-time job, but it can be challenging because if you are a first-gen student, you might not have anyone in your household with which to share those stresses and those successes that come along with being in college. So there's a huge intercultural strain of living in these two different cultures, right? Where you have to go to school one day and be a scholar, and then at home it's weird to kind of talk about an experience that you have at college when other people may not be able to connect to it or might not be someone in your family's priority, right? They might not be able to connect with your experience of being in college, and that can be challenging and isolating. So it's important to remember that first-gen college students have that unique kind of intersection of identity. All right, so I know there was a lot of terms to unpack, but what are we going to do with this knowledge? Because I'm a big believer in figuring out, well, I learned that, and what am I supposed to do with it now? What's the point? And so let me tell y'all what's the point. One of the biggest things that we have to remember is that once we understand terms like race, ethnicity, gender, once we've learned all the different cultural values that you learned in the last video and what implicit bias is in the first video, you learn that our culture is primarily expressed through nonverbal and verbal language, and that becomes a dominant way that we experience the world in our lives. What are codes? Codes relate to culture because culture dictates what certain verbal and nonverbal codes or behaviors are acceptable or not acceptable, right? So let's kind of dive deep into what this idea means. First off, it's important to remember that language impacts our worldview, right? People generally feel most confident, of course, when they're communicating in their native language. Even though I speak English very regularly, I am most comfortable speaking in Vietnamese, and I actually sometimes feel that I can express what I'm saying more intimately and more sincerely with my native language. At times, I also feel that even my second language of Spanish, I actually am able to express my ideas more clearly in Spanish, because I feel like sometimes I can't find the right words of what I need to say in English. And so if you are someone that's bilingual or trilingual like me, you might feel like I just need to default to my native language to really express what I'm saying. Language impacts our worldview a lot because if you live in a place where everyone speaks the same language doesn't really impact your self-concept. It doesn't impact your identity as much because you're just basically talking like everyone else does. But if you've had to grow up where you speak one language and the dominant language is different, so for example, the dominant language in the United States is English, but I grew up learning Vietnamese and English and Spanish at the same time, I had a stronger sense of being an out-group sometimes because I felt different because of my need to learn English initially, right? And recognizing that the language that I speak is not a dominant one. If you are someone that is an immigrant or your parents are of immigrant descent, they may also have experienced the same experience where if they are speaking Spanish, Vietnamese, Chinese, Portuguese, or any other language out in public, they may experience a strong sense of being an out-group member because they're speaking a language that might not be the dominant language in that area. So, verbal comm styles are also really important to remember. When you're looking at not just the language itself, but the style of the way it's spoken, you have to kind of take that into account when you're understanding the differences between cultures and their languages. So the first one is directness or indirectness. You can have a style of speaking where you're very direct, very straightforward, or you can have one that's very indirect, right? For example, I taught for a summer once in Japan. And when I was booking my hotel, I emailed a Japanese colleague there and I said, hey, I picked this hotel. What do you think of it? Is it a good location? Is it easy for me to take the subway to get to work from there? What do you think? And he emailed me back and said, I think this is good, and I think other places might be good as well. And I'm like, that's a really indirect way of saying, what do you mean? And so he was trying to tell me that I had accidentally booked a hotel in the red light district. For those of you who don't know what a red light district is, it's a district that tends to have a lot of businesses and businesses and neighborhoods that involve a lot of late night activities. And so because of that, he didn't want to directly say that because he comes from a culture that's very indirect. They don't really directly state something because they're worried about embarrassing you because they're from a collectivist culture. So he was very indirect with trying to tell me you should probably book a different hotel, right? If in America we're very direct in the way that we talk, generally speaking. So we're not as indirect as a culture like Japanese people are. There are other styles, such as being elaborate or succinct. So some cultures like to be very detailed in what they say, right? And some cultures like it to be short and sweet and to the point, right? Elaborate cultures tend to be more low context. And so you'll see that low context cultures tend to like to talk a lot, right? And provide a lot of detail about something when they're sharing something with someone. And then there's formality and informality. Some cultures are very formal, so cultures like mine tend to have a lot of titles built into the language. And so in my language, we don't use pronouns like you and I. We call people by their title or what they are, how they are related to us, right? So it's a very formalized language, whereas informal languages like English tend to involve words like I or you that kind of simplify the language a little bit more. In addition, you might be someone that has gotten into code switching. And code switching is this idea that communicators have to adapt to different contexts that they're in, right? And so they do it often to achieve their goals in that interaction. So, for example, if you work in retail and when you're at work, you speak in a different tone of voice and you phrase things differently in order to please your customer or provide different customer service, you're engaging in code switching, right? You've learned that in that context, this is the type of communication that works for you. A friend of mine works in retail and she calls it her customer service voice, right? And then she defaults to a different voice when she's not doing that type of work. Code switching also involves changing the way that you speak to different people in different contexts. Immigrants tend to code switch the most because they typically have to change their conversation style to match that of the dominant group. I come from an immigrant background where my language is spoken much more softly and we say a lot less. Our words, we come from a high context culture where we don't value people that talk too much. We actually view that people that talk too much as being dumb, right? And so I've had to learn or code switch to change the way that I speak so that it matches a little bit more with Americanized ways of thinking about how we talk. Even right now, when I'm lecturing to you, I have code switched into a more Americanized way of presenting. I'm giving you direct eye contact, I'm using my teacher voice, I'm gesturing. These are all things that I would not be doing if I were speaking to someone or lecturing in my native country, in my native culture. So this is an example of code switching, switching the way you're delivering messages to match the cultural values of a dominant culture. Woo! That's a lot. So what are we supposed to do with all this information? So I love ending lectures with actionable things that students can do to kind of forward their lives, right? And do something with this knowledge other than memorize it for a test. So we need to start developing communication competence. This is what we do with the knowledge that we have, right? So how do we do that? We do that with these three things here. The first thing you need is motivation and attitude. Motivation and attitude, please, before I go on. Motivation and attitude are very normal words that we might use every day. But when I ask you in a quiz, wink, wink, or online on our class, what motivation and attitude refers to, I'm specifically talking about it in this context. The desire to communicate successfully with other strangers or people from different cultures. Why is motivation and attitude needed? First, motivation is so important because if you don't want something, it ain't gonna happen, right? So you need to have the right motivation and the right mindset when you enter into intercultural interactions with other people. 99.9% of your intercultural interactions with other people will not work out the way you think they will, right? People are complex and you can't predict how every interaction is going to be. So motivation refers to this idea that you have a desire, an unending desire to be successful, that you don't give up and that you have grit when it comes to these challenges. Attitude refers to that positive aspect, right? That you approach it with a positive and open mindset, right? And you need both of these in order to be successful. Why? Because let's say you travel to a different country and you try communicating with someone and it doesn't work out the way you think you want it to, right? You need to continue to have motivation because you have to be able to bounce back from an interaction that was not successful. And then you also have to have the right attitude to perceive that interaction as a learning moment rather than a moment for you to give up. That's why both of these are needed in order to become a competent intercultural communicator. You also need knowledge and skill, which is what you're gaining here. So, while I can't give you motivation and I can't give you the right attitude, those are things you have to develop yourself. Knowledge and skill, hopefully, are what I'm giving you here in this class, in this lecture. Knowledge and skill refers to the idea that you have the knowledge or you have a background and understanding of how culture functions, which hopefully you got from this lecture. And you have the skill in order to apply it in different contexts, right? So again, you know what approaches are appropriate in a given context. You know what makes sense. So the knowledge you gained here was you learned about different cultural values, right? You learned about 5 of them and how they impact the way people see the world and how they impact communication. You also learned about different terms like race and ethnicity and gender and how those impact our lives and how those impact our worldview. That's knowledge. Skill refers to the idea that you're able to put that knowledge into practice in that interaction. How do you develop skill? You do it through these 3 ways. You can do it through passive observation, which is when you observe other people and you try to mimic what they're doing, kind of monkey see, monkey do. Active strategies are about trying to learn more about individuals and their culture. This could be reading a culture's books, watching their films, asking experts, and experts can include maybe people that are from that culture, right? Everyday people that might be able to shed more light on how that culture functions. Self-disclosure is another strategy you can use. This is when you share with someone else in a different culture an intimate detail about yourself, like your learning process and what you're going through, and in the hopes that they self-disclose back to you so that you can learn more about them, they can learn more about you, and you've become better at understanding how they function as a person and how they communicate. This is why I'm really big into discussion boards, so that you all can learn from each other, because you may all come from the wide culture of being an American or being in America, but you all share different cultures. And so by having you share out your perspectives and ideas on discussion boards, I'm having you do this thing right here where you learn about someone else's perspective and you also self-disclose your perspective, so it's a mutual relationship of learning about how another culture perceives something. So I hope that this lecture has been helpful for you. I know it was a lot of information all at once, so this is by no means, an end-all be-all comprehensive thing. If you need more help, you know where to find me. Just send me a message on Canvas, and I'm more than happy to play with any of these terms or any of these ideas with you as we continue this discussion. Discussions about identity are always ongoing. They never end. And so this is really just the start, y'all. This is just the start of our knowledge and our journeys of being intercultural communicators. I will see you all at the next video lecture. Bye.